In March 1980, in rural Cambridgeshire, the body of Sally McGrath was discovered, a young woman who'd vanished 8 months earlier.
Her body had been discovered naked but for a pair of boots.
Investigations quickly led to Paul Taylor, a local man with a string of allegations against him.
He was brutal and he was dominant and he was willing to kill.
With just a circumstantial case, the police were unable to bring charges. And for decades, Taylor lived his life deceiving those around him.
I never thought he was capable of murdering anybody. Never.
But in 2009, a determined cold case team took on Sally McGrath's murder, winning justice not just for Sally, but for all the women he brutalised.
Those women that secured those verdicts, they must have felt at last that somebody believed them.
Justice was 33 years in the making, but Paul Taylor had finally been exposed as one of Britain's most evil killers. When Kareem Khalil KC presented the Crown's case against Paul Taylor at Chelmsford Crown Court in 2012, he was all too aware he was inviting them to enter a different world.
One goes back in time, back to 1979, 1980. Just features of how investigations were carried out, what people accepted as normal, which you then have to try and transport into a modern setting and explain to jurors that this is how it was.
Part of the challenge was getting jurors to understand how Sally McGrath and Taylor's other victims had found themselves alone in his company.
I think Peterborough in 1979 was very different to how it is today, having grown up in the 70s. I also know that there was an element of trust that people had that we don't necessarily have now.
The prosecution team also faced the challenge of explaining why so little had been done to stop Taylor in the 1970s and 80s.
Other women had made complaints about Paul Taylor. We have to try and understand what the attitudes were and the social mores of the time.
Disbelieved, dissuaded, or shamed into silence, some of Taylor's victims kept their counsel for decades. But with the investigation into Sally McGrath's murder, finally came justice. This killer's story begins in the city of Peterborough in Cambridgeshire. Born on the 9th of March 1952, little is known about Paul Taylor's early years.
What's clear is by the time he was a teenager, he was beginning to go off the rails. He got his first conviction for dishonesty at the age of 16, and it just went on from there. Perhaps in search of structure or discipline, Taylor spent a couple of years in the army as a young man.
In 1974, Taylor got married and started a family, living on the outskirts of Peterborough. With a population of around 100,000 people at the time, the Cambridgeshire city sometimes felt more like a town.
It was a much smaller community. There was very few places for people to go to, so a lot of people knew each other really well, or there was always a connection.
Paul Taylor was working as a local builder, had a works van and access to other quite nice looking cars.
We have a river that runs through the centre of Peterborough called the Mean, so Taylor had his own boat at the time, and he would go out and about, in the summer on his boat.
Taylor's flashy vehicles were a tool he used for picking up women.
Locally, he was regarded as a bit of a Jack the Lad figure, strongly built, quite a handsome man, and very charming. He had a couple of children and seemed to be living a married life on the one hand, but also frequently womanizing on the other.
Taylor was described as a womanizer. Now, we use that term almost to say lovable rogue. Womanizer actually means manipulative predator, and that's what he was. Somebody like Taylor uses his charm to get what he wants. He's not a charming person. This is an act to get him what he wants.
Taylor sought out casual sex with women and girls he met. In August 1974, one claimed that while alone with Taylor, he had turned nasty.
She was 17 years old, had gone out for drinks with him, and he drove her to an isolated location, became very abusive towards her, started calling her horrific names, started slapping her, and then went on to rape her.
The teenager went to the police.
It went to court, but he was acquitted, and part of that was around whether it was possible to commit a rape in an MG sports car. He later went on to brag that it actually was possible to commit a rape in a sports car and that he'd just got away with it.
For Paul Taylor, a pattern of behaviour had been set.
Personally, I think because he got away with it in court, it gave him a great belief that he could go on and commit crime, and he was beyond reproach in his world.
A stone's throw from the centre of Peterborough lived a young woman called Sally Ann McGrath. In 1979, she was 22 years old and living with her parents.
She lived in the Woodston area of the city. I think they were quite a close-knit family. Sally was at that point in life where she didn't have any ties as such. She did have a wide circle of friends. Some of those had described her as, like the life and soul of the party. Someone who you'd probably want to have on a night out, good company.
She used to travel with other girlfriends in a bus that went up to the local RAF base with the US Air Forcemen, partied there, and was known pretty widely and much liked.
But on Wednesday, the 11th of July 1979, Sally McGrath seemingly vanished into thin air.
Sally didn't return home that evening, and I think her mum Christine initially was concerned.
It wasn't unusual for Sally to go out and perhaps have a late night, but she'd always come back.
Sally's mum started asking around to see whether any of her friends knew where she was, and then eventually reported Sally missing to the police.
In the first few days after Sally vanished, her parents searched local cafes, nightclubs, and football grounds for her, as well as walking the streets, showing her photograph to strangers. On Saturday, the 14th of July, Peterborough Police took over the search, building a picture of Sally's last known movements.
Initially, an officer attended, took all the details. She went out on the 11th of July 1979 with the intention of signing on at the local DSS office.
As well as signing on, what we now know is she'd also gone into town to go for a drink with who she said were friends at the Bull Hotel in Peterborough, which still exists to this day.
A friend who'd seen Sally that day told police that Sally had plans to meet a boyfriend later that evening at another pub, the Golden Fleece. She'd never shown up for the rendezvous.
The missing from home inquiry became quite large, and there was a lot of effort put into trying to locate Sally. But after a number of months, in essence, the trail went cold.
When somebody went missing back in 1979, it's a very, very different landscape to now. There was no such thing as mobile phones. CCTV was not as proliferated as it is now, unless you really have got witnesses to say, oh, I saw Sally at this time, at this place. It's really difficult to put that jigsaw together.
There was initial thoughts from part of the investigation team that she'd perhaps gone to a dance, gone off with a GI, and Some people even said that, potentially she'd moved abroad, but I think those who knew Sally knew that that wasn't the case.
Sally's parents feared the worst, but they never stopped hoping for her safe return. On the 1st of March 1980, 8 months after Sally's sudden disappearance, their worst fears were realised.
There was a gamekeeper preparing for an organised shoot who was walking through a very remote area called Castor Hanglands, which is a rural area on the west side of Peterborough.
He was just going through the undergrowth in Castor Hanglands. He came across a boot and obviously wasn't perhaps sure at first what he'd found.
When he looked closer, the gamekeeper discovered it was not just a pair of women's boots in the dirt. He realised with horror they were attached to a human body. On the 1st of March 1980, 8 months after the disappearance of 22-year-old Sally McGrath, the body of a woman was discovered in a remote Cambridgeshire woodland.
The orange tape leads to the spot where the body was found, and police say it could well have lain hidden for 100 years had it not been for a passing gamekeeper who was out shooting rabbits when he found the body covered in branches. Hardly anyone comes to these woods apart from a pheasant shoot once a year. Police say the murderer may well have known that fact, and that's why he chose this spot to dump the body.
The body was found in a shallowly dug grave.
There were few identifying features to the body.
Given the passage of time, it would have been quite decomposed.
She was naked bar the boots that she was wearing on her feet.
With the area declared a crime scene, the first priority was to identify the remains. And very quickly, 22-year-old Sally McGrath's name was on the lips of investigating officers. She'd gone missing the previous July.
They would have had files of missing people and would have been able to quickly identify from her boots, for example, that it was probably going to be the remains of Sally.
She was identified as a result of her possessions, her jewellery and dental records as well.
Hours after Sally's heartbroken parents had been informed, a post-mortem was carried out which pointed to a violent death.
Sally had some facial injuries, her nose was broken and she had 2 blunt force traumas to her skull, so the assessment was that she met her death as a consequence of being violently assaulted to her head.
The discovery spelled horror not only for Sally's family but also for the community of this small city.
When Sally's body was found and she was nearly naked, clear signs that this was possibly sexual offending and possibly an abduction. It would have been incredibly shocking, terrifying to realise that nightmare was there in that community. And of course, with everybody realising that that person was still at large.
What was initiated was the biggest murder investigation that Cambridgeshire Police had ever engaged in at that stage.
There's no question that police dedicated an enormous amount of effort. I think 3,000 interviews.
Detectives' first move was to return to the records of the inquiries made when Sally had vanished 8 months earlier. There had been 17 sightings of Sally that day, the last a little after lunchtime.
She was seen by a lady, a female witness, at 2:40 outside the Bull Public House, and she was seen with a male.
She'd also been seen earlier by witnesses inside the pub with the same young man.
They could see that they appeared to be close in terms of how they were talking. Quite a good-looking, striking young man who, again, not someone who blended into the background, someone who you kind of would notice. The people who had seen them together in the Bull were able to get an artist's impression drawn of him.
The drawing had a striking resemblance to another well-known local, Paul Taylor. The 27-year-old had recently been sentenced to 3 years in prison for a series of burglaries and assaulting a 16-year-old girl. Friends of Taylor's confirmed he'd been in the Bull that afternoon, and witnesses saw Sally and Taylor together. As the last person seen with Sally, police tried to track Taylor's movements for the rest of that day.
On the day of Sally McGrath's disappearance, Paul Taylor was due to sign on because he was on bail for matters. And he'd been signing on absolutely properly for a period of time, but this proved to be the one day in his bail period which he failed to sign on at all.
Because he'd failed to sign on time, and because he was on curfew, they sent police officers around to his address at 10:30 that evening to do a curfew check, and he wasn't there. His vehicle wasn't there. And his wife answered the door and said he wasn't there.
In addition to that, on the night that Sally went missing, a witness also reported a van which fitted the description of a van that Taylor had in the vicinity of Castanglands as well.
Going back through their records, detectives began to suspect that Sally's murder was something the jobbing builder could well be capable of.
The police were aware of a number of allegations of rape and attempted rape by Taylor on other women, but in each case there was insufficient evidence to prosecute Taylor for those offences.
Some of those complaints were really rather brushed off. Some of them were taken seriously, but then in the absence of what they called corroboration evidence, it couldn't be pursued to trial. And so women were effectively told, look, I hear your complaint, but there's really not much we can do about it.
But because of the allegations, there was real concern that Taylor was an active predatory rapist, and that might have been his motivation for ultimately killing Sally.
It was enough to prompt officers to visit Taylor, who by now was serving time in prison.
Paul Taylor was interviewed by the detectives on the murder inquiry as a key suspect, a person of interest.
The default position of Taylor was a straight denial of almost everything, and he denied knowing Sally McGrath, ever having met her.
In a bizarre twist, an article about Taylor's latest conviction had appeared side by side with an article about Sally's murder 5 days after her body was found.
Now, had that been engineered by the police, or was it simply coincidence? We simply don't know. What we do know is that the police were convinced for a very long time that Taylor was guilty of her murder.
If the police hoped news articles like this would prompt new witnesses to come forward, they were disappointed. Paul Taylor remained the prime and only suspect in Sally's murder, but he was still not charged.
The police put all the evidence together. That file was reviewed by counsel, and it was felt that whilst there was a lot of evidence that suggested Taylor was responsible, there just wasn't enough evidence for them to be sure that they would get a conviction at court.
At the time, the evidence of the women who claimed Taylor had assaulted them couldn't form part of the prosecution for Sally's murder.
Similar fact evidence wasn't admissible in the same way as it is now.
So ultimately, the case was filed as an undetected murder.
With the case effectively cold, Sally's family were left with no answers, while Paul Taylor served out his sentence for theft and assault.
When Taylor came out of jail, he decided he was going to relocate, and in fact he moved to Hampshire, to Fareham, and he got married again. Did he change his spots? Was he a different man?
Almost 3 decades later, in December 2010, 58-year-old Paul Taylor's second wife, Janet, was awoken at their home in Hampshire by an early morning knock at the door. It was the police.
They said, "Is Paul Taylor here?" And I said, "Upstairs." And they said, "Right, we're going to arrest him." I had no idea what was going on, because there was police everywhere. Everywhere. They cordoned off the street. They were out the back of the house. They took me down the police station. They were asking me questions, but they weren't going to tell me exactly what they were charging him with. So they were asking me about him, and I just truthfully answered the questions because he'd never been violent to me, ever.
Janet knew little of the truth of her husband's past. In the late 1980s, after the couple first moved in together, they'd received some unsettling visits from local detectives.
He moved in with me, and the police started knocking the door about local murders, local rapes and stuff like that.
By way of explanation, Taylor lied to Janet that he'd served time a few years earlier for GBH and assaulting a police officer, and so the police had it in for him.
I remember him saying to me at the time, when I was in prison, they came to me to question me about a murder in there, but it was because the police were persecuting him.
Taylor didn't mention the name Sally McGrath to his wife, and Janet had no reason to doubt her husband's version of events. The visits from the police stopped until December 2010. After several days of questioning, Taylor was bailed. For months, nothing happened.
He wouldn't really talk about it. I said to him, you don't seem worried about it. I would be panicking if someone was accusing me of doing something I hadn't done. So he said, I haven't done it. They'll never pin it on me. Why have I got to worry? He didn't lose sleep. He didn't stop eating. And he would say, you do believe me, don't you?
58-year-old Paul Taylor was confident his past could not catch up with him. He hadn't reckoned on the tenacity of the police and the voices of his many victims coming back to haunt him. In 2009, 3 decades after the event, the unsolved murder of 22-year-old Sally McGrath had landed on the desk of Cambridgeshire police detective Jeff Hill.
One of my DIs brought the case to me and said, look, I think they were really close, they probably identified the right guy, they just didn't have enough evidence.
Much of the physical evidence from the 1980 investigation had been destroyed years earlier in a flood, but the reams of paper records made for eye-opening reading. Jobbing builder Paul Taylor had done little to put police off the scent.
One of the lines of inquiry that the police at the time pursued was to interview other prisoners at Bedford Prison, where Taylor had been sent following his conviction for the offences of burglary that he was on bail for when Sally went missing.
Taylor couldn't resist boasting that he appeared to have got away with raping a girl in a car because the police didn't think it could have happened in such a small space, and indicating that he had killed Sally, but good luck to the police trying to prove it.
The files also held letters Taylor had written from prison to his first wife, urging her to burn his belongings.
It was a number of letters he sent, almost on consecutive days, saying, have you collected the clothes yet? Have you got my tools? Make sure you destroy them.
More certain than ever they were looking at the right man, Jeff Hill's first task was to visit Sally McGrath's parents, who still lived in the home Sally had never returned to 30 years earlier.
I was shown into the parlour of this Victorian house. Sally's mum came out with a pot of tea on a tray and a cup and a saucer, and her dad sat in an armchair. He was elderly, he was in his mid to late 80s. And I'll never forget this because I explained to Sally's mum that we were there because we were going to reinvestigate Sally's murder. And Sally's mum said to me that she was a very spiritual person. And for years after Sally's disappearance, she dreamt about Sally every single evening. And that she knew I was going to come today because Sally had told her in a dream the previous evening. Determined
to find resolution for Sally's still grieving family, Jeff and his team set about following the evidence.
We were completely 100% happy that the last person that Sally was seen with in the Poole Public House on the 11th of July was Paul Barry Taylor.
And while Taylor had always denied ever knowing Sally, detectives discovered this was far from the truth.
During the original investigation, a guy by the name of Paul, who was a young lad, 16 at the time, lived next door to Taylor. He was interviewed by the inquiry, and he basically said that he had no information of any relevance whatsoever. He was employed by Taylor on a very casual basis as a builder's mate. There's no doubt in my mind that he was frightened of Taylor, and I think he was probably frightened of the police as well.
30 years later, the scared 16-year-old boy was now a middle-aged man, and Taylor's former employee told the cold case team what he knew about Paul Taylor meeting Sally weeks before she disappeared.
He recalled them driving along in the works van, Taylor seeing Sally sitting on a bench, stopping, engaging in conversation with her. I think numbers were swapped.
The former apprentice had another story to tell, one that was far more disturbing. A few weeks before Sally McGrath vanished, a teenage girl was walking near a local river when Paul Taylor approached her and struck up conversation. He was with his young apprentice.
Because there was two of them, she felt really safe, and the one lad was very similar age to her, so she said she felt very comfortable. They were very charming, and she went for a little boat ride. A short time later, she saw them again, and they said, "Do you want to come out on a boat ride again?"
I think the line he used was that he needed to get a part for his boat or something, so he's going out to somewhere in the country where he could get a part for his boat, and he drove in his van to Castor.
This particular girl, because she was a girl at the time, was then taken to Wild Boar Spinney.
Wild Boar Spinney was in the same area of Castor Hanglands where Sally McGrath's body would be found.
When they got there, Paul Taylor opened the glove box and there were some condoms within the glove box.
His young apprentice was told to take the van for a drive.
And was told in no uncertain terms to get lost, and he said, "I was just frightened and I drove away crying, thinking that I should be doing something, but I just wasn't brave enough to do it."
He said his fear was if he left to get help, he wouldn't be able to get his way back because he wouldn't know where to find them, but he knew that what was going to happen wasn't going to be good.
When the teenage boy returned to the clearing 20 minutes later, the girl was in obvious distress, her t-shirt ripped from neck to waistband.
Paul Taylor stood there with a condom still on, which he took off and flung. So they all got back in the van, and on the way back, Paul Taylor stopped for ice cream.
Taylor dropped the girl off in the centre of town, giving her a couple of pounds to buy a new t-shirt so that her parents wouldn't know what had happened. Just 2 weeks later, Sally McGrath vanished, her body eventually turning up in the same remote location the girl had been attacked by Paul Taylor. As the cold case detectives went back over the files, they saw a clear pattern emerging.
When they then started looking at Paul Taylor and realised actually how many different victims had come forward, not just the rape that he was acquitted for. And I think they then thought, we need to go back and we need to re-interview these women.
DC Haley Dias was one of the detectives tasked with tracking down the half a dozen women whose statements were in the files from 1979 and 1980.
How do the victims react when you go and knock on the door? 30 years later, I think it's fair to say they're shocked. But none of them were unwavering in their commitment to ensure that we got the case solved.
By re-interviewing the victims, detectives plotted a timeline of violent sexual attacks with strikingly similar features in the months before Sally's murder. The first was the prolonged ordeal he put a 19-year-old woman through in March 1979.
been picked up from the Bull Public House in Peterborough. He drove her to an isolated spot. She was a virgin. She was pleading with him. He was becoming more and more aggressive, and he was trying to force her to drink whiskey, which she didn't want to drink.
Taylor raped the young woman in a particularly sustained and brutal attack.
He took her to a local hotel, and whilst at the hotel, he repeatedly raped her during the course of the night.
He went to sleep. She lay on bed all night, terrified. But in the morning, he got up and he was a different person. And it was almost like, I'm your boyfriend, you're my girlfriend now. Very Jekyll and Hyde character, back to being Mr. Nice Guy and everything. He ate breakfast, she didn't. But he drove her home.
30 years later, the police were able to corroborate much of the woman's account. 3 weeks after the attack, Taylor struck again.
In the April, he went to a family christening, and towards the end of that christening, a young woman wanted a lift home. He offered to take her, as previously didn't take her to the required or desired destination, and he raped her in the motor car.
The cold case detectives also managed to track down the teenage girl the young apprentice had witnessed being attacked at Castor Hanglands. She described how in June 1979 it had dawned on her what Paul Taylor's intentions were as he sent his teenage workmate away.
She said, I'm so sorry if I've led you on in any way whatsoever, but I can't, I can't have sex. I'm a virgin. My family are really strict. We're a strict Catholic family. I'm sorry if I've said anything or I've done anything that's made you think that I want to have sex, but I really don't. I just want to go home. He laughed and he grabbed her by the legs and he yanked her out of the van. So she struck her head on the way out of the van.
The long-term consequences for this particular victim were catastrophic.
Her family insisted she should track him down and try and cause him to marry her, despite what he'd just done to her.
The terrified Catholic teen did as she was told, only to discover her attacker was married with a family.
She was actually kicked out of home at the age of 17 by her parents for bringing dishonour on the family.
Another woman, Hayley Dias, and the team re-interviewed in 2010, told of a savage attack that had taken place in August 1979, a month or so after Sally's murder, when the victim was just 16.
It was an attempt rape in the back of the van, but it was an attempt rape that also amounted to GBH, where he'd hit her and beaten her quite severely in his attempt at raping her.
When she resisted, he struck her, but then used a metal petrol can to strike her around the head several times.
It's an horrific attack. She was laid up for a long time.
And that again was of interest to us, given the fact that we know that Sally had died as a consequence of blunt force trauma.
Detectives were building up a picture of a man who used charm to pick up women, offering them a lift or a ride out in his car, van or boat before turning aggressive and forcing sexual acts upon them.
Taylor didn't want consent. That's not the turn on. They want you to fight. They want to look at your face and to know that you do not want what's happening to you. So he will do something to make sure that woman removes her consent. Maybe something like suddenly changing and becoming quite sinister and threatening and horrible and insulting, maybe violent and aggressive. The woman gets frightened, she stops consenting. Now we're where he wanted to be.
Having corroborated the details of so many violent attacks, by the autumn of 2011, cold case detectives were confident in their case. After getting away with a litany of violent attacks for 3 decades, Paul Taylor's days as a free man were numbered. By October 2011, investigators had enough not only to charge 59-year-old Paul Taylor for Sally McGrath's murder, but also with 3 counts of rape, a sexual assault, and an indecent assault. The news came as a terrible shock to Taylor's wife, Janet.
I went with him while he was charged. I just had a bit of a panic attack, couldn't breathe. Everything just went blank. It was just really hard to listen to. I didn't want to hear that, but I knew he'd done it.
Faced with what her husband was being accused of, misgivings from their relationship resurfaced for Janet.
He didn't like women. If he ever spoke about a woman, he would always run them down, or he would be always very negative in what any of his friends' wives were like. He would always be, oh, she's fat, oh, she's ugly, or she's domineering.
A friend told Janet of rumours about Taylor's predatory behaviour.
He just cheated constantly through the whole marriage, and he was just obsessed with sex. Not with me. He wasn't like that with me. I was his safe space, I think. His safe space and his normal space. He could be at home and then disappear and be that monster that he is.
"60-year-old Paul Taylor's trial began at Chelmsford Crown Court in October 2012. Kareem Khalil KC presented the prosecution's case.
Our contention as to why Sally had been murdered was that this was a sexual assault primarily. The pattern of his behaviour was of sexual assault and, if there was resistance, physical assault to get what he wanted. And so we surmised that he had taken Sally off, as he had others, to a secluded spot, had insisted on sexually assaulting her. She must have resisted forcibly.
It's quite possible that Sally put up more of a fight than he was used to. He knew when he changed the state of play, her screams wouldn't be heard, but she fought harder than he ever imagined. And I think that's why she got killed.
We could actually demonstrate that he was not beyond striking a woman to the head and face to ensure that she became compliant to his needs. And then when we have the terrible skull injuries that were found on Sally McGrath's body, that really fitted the same sort of pattern.
Each of the women who alleged assaults by Paul Taylor bravely took the stand to give evidence against him.
Each of the women whose cases were prosecuted on the indictment wanted their allegations heard and determined.
In court, it's not just reliving it, it's reliving it to somebody who's going to call you a liar, because that is what will happen. So that's awful. That's awful.
They just wanted to be heard and for people to say, yes, this is wrong.
Their lives, in many cases, had changed dramatically as a consequence of what had happened. Some had kept it a secret from their partners. Some hadn't been able to form any kind of lasting relationships. It was really difficult, and those poor women were incredibly courageous to revisit something which I suspect in a lot of cases they'd packaged up and put into a lockbox in their mind.
The woman whose allegations in 1974 had resulted in Paul Taylor being tried for rape also agreed to give evidence in 2012.
Due to double jeopardy, unless we could come up with some new and compelling evidence, then we were unable to lay charges again. She very bravely attended court and she gave evidence by way of bad character evidence about what had happened to her.
The man who'd been Taylor's teenage apprentice in 1979 also gave powerful testimony, not only about the attack he'd witnessed, but also telling the jury he'd seen Taylor burning clothes in the days after the attacks, and that Taylor had made the boy clean out his work van. The van featured again in another intriguing piece of police work.
We trawled through the classified ads and found the day after Sally went missing, he advertised his vehicle for sale. Why would you sell your livelihood if it wasn't to get rid of evidence of Sally's disappearance and murder?
The defence argument, which was also Taylor's argument, consistently was that all the sex I had in the 70s and early 80s was entirely consensual.
Paul Taylor did not choose to take the stand. After an 8-week trial, the jury retired to consider a case that had presented no DNA evidence and could be seen as being entirely circumstantial.
We believed we'd presented about as strong a case as we possibly could. And we didn't have to wait terribly long for the verdicts to be returned. And indeed, they did come back exactly as we had hoped.
Paul Taylor was convicted of Sally McGrath's murder, as well as 5 counts of rape and sexual assault.
I cried because it means a lot. But it's fair to say there was a lot of screaming, crying, whooping with joy, not being able to speak.
We went across to the pub just opposite the Crown Court at Chelmsford. We had a drink with Sally's mum and her brother. But at the end of the drink, Sally's brother turned round to us and said, "Look, Jeff, we can never repay you for what you've done. We'll always be incredibly grateful. But we never want to see you again now." And at the time I thought, wow, but very, very quickly and in the moment realised that's just the way in which they wanted to achieve some form of closure. I'm glad they did.
For the women who faced their attacker in court after so much time, it was a watershed moment.
For them, all of them, it has given them a closure. It's come at a cost. It's come with post-traumatic stress. But they see you, and these are their words, not ours, as their guardian angels, that you've come into their life, you've believed them.
On the 5th of December 2012, Paul Taylor was sentenced to life with a minimum tariff of 18 years, a sentence reflecting guidelines for the era when the crimes were committed.
Although it might seem a somewhat lenient sentence by the standards of today's terms, he's over 60 years old, not eligible to be released until he's almost 80.
For Taylor's wife Janet, the conviction was a brutal confirmation of what she'd come to accept about the person she'd married.
I learnt that he was a vile, evil. He's not even a human being. He's just disgusting. What he did was just above and beyond horrendous. And not that many people would lie just to put him in prison. So it had to be true.
With a number of more recent accusations against Taylor left to lie on file, it remains to be seen if he's ever considered safe for parole. In the meantime, Sally McGrath's family finally have answers, as do the many women he brutalised for his own twisted satisfaction. He got away with murder for more than 30 years, but Paul Taylor was finally unmasked as one of Britain's most evil killers.